It says we're going to go from Matthew 23, but I decided to skip that. You can read that on your own, where Jesus just calls out and he says, "You bad lawyers and politicians and leaders and religious folks," and he gets so angry at him and calls them names. We're going to focus just on the verses from 21. When Jesus takes the table, and you thought I was going to flip it because I'm so good at object lessons, but no. Why in the world is the Prince of Peace so unhinged at this junction? Why is he so angry? It doesn't mean that we're allowed to be angry. You have a guess?
Yeah. Because it's a thief's den.
Yeah, and sometimes that robber's den word just gets thrown out there, and the idea of that is it's like when the old Western thieves would go find a cave and they'd put all their money in there and they'd hide away and look around and make sure no one got them. That's the idea that Jesus is talking about. He's saying you have created this place where you hide all the junk, which doesn't mean we get to be angry just because Jesus is, but it might give us some reason for how to look at the places in the world where those people are hoarding and hiding. So let's answer some historical and cultural context, some details about ancient Hebrew life that to them was just so obvious as to be air. Like, there are things about our life that generations on are going to think like, oh, that was interesting, but to us we don't even question it. So for them, we're going to check in step by step, and I promise after we learn a lot about ancient Hebrew culture, we'll kind of land the plane after a few points here. So first, the temple in those days was a one-of-a-kind, holy, mega-holy place. It still is, even though there's only about 2% of it still standing. In those days, it was really a wonder of the world, and even in those days, regular Jews, they could worship in their own homes and week after week in their own towns, usually down at the biggest house of their friend, because that was the only place where everyone could fit. But they would eat and sing and pray and learn about God, and that was worship. Awesome, great. But there were some things that they could only do at the temple. And it's kind of like this. Here's your parable. Isn't it great that football is back? I love that football is back. I get to have a draft tonight. I've been watching some preseason games. Some of you like watching football on TV because it's better than going to the games because there's lots of crowds. I don't really like crowds. But you all know, if you've ever been to any stadium, there's something special about just something happening and you're so happy you hug a stranger and spill your hot dog. That can't happen in your living room. No matter how many hot dogs you spill, there just aren't strangers in your living room. And the feeling of when that surprise touchdown happens and the whole stadium just starts to shake, you don't get that unless you're at this special place. And for ancient Jews, the Super Bowl of their faith was, you cannot get right with God unless you go to the temple. Maybe you do it once a year, 4 times a year, once a lifetime, whatever it was. But the thing that mattered spiritually to them happens at the temple, at the altar. All the rest of their faith is tailgating. Tailgating's fun. I like to tailgate. But that wasn't the point of their faith. Now maybe you think that's crazy. For you, you can get right with God in the woods or at church or in your living room or whatever. That's fine. I might even agree with you on some of that. But for ancient Jews, 1,000 years before Jesus, you just can't get balanced with God unless you go to the temple and make a sacrifice. Make sense? Say yes.
Yeah.
All right. That's just step 1. There's a lot of steps here. We've got to build this whole thing. Step 2, a sacrifice. What the heck is that? We don't do that here. A sacrifice was taking an animal, taking its life on the altar, having a priest say just a special prayer while sprinkling the blood here and over there, which sounds so weird to us, but that was their system, normal as air. That was the way they expressed their contrition, their blessing, their thankfulness. That was the way they expressed their prayer, and to say, God, thank you for being on my side. Please always be on my side. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So Jesus wasn't against that, per se. He was okay with religious sacrifices. He was against that being a requirement to get right with God's grace, but that's not why he's flipping tables today. In fact, just in a few days, he's going to be a human sacrifice on the cross, but on this story, he has some other fish to fry that are going to have a lot more relevance to your life. So third, of course, if you were rich, you could afford a better sacrifice. So if you were rich, you bought a bull, you sacrificed the bull, you had a big feast. Great barbecue. If you were middle class, you might sacrifice a goat, and then your family has a stew, and that's the meat you get to eat for the year. But if you're poor, did you hear in the story, what did poor people sacrifice? Pigeons, pigeon doves. Yeah, gross, huh? And pretty small. If that's all the meat your family gets for the whole year, that's some important pigeon right there. So 4, getting on a roll here. Now, Jews all over the world, they wanted to get right with God, but who wants to drag a bunch of pigeons all the way to Jerusalem from like Lebanon? Who wants to to have a bull walk all the way from Egypt to Jerusalem. It's just not going to happen. So, because that's a pain, and because people are ingenuous and they love convenience and they really like to make a buck, this market grew up right beside the temple, where locals would sell animals for tourists to sacrifice. Make sense?
Yes.
It's just part of their life. It's like walking down to one of our stores. So 5, here's the thing. Back to the football game. Not just anyone's allowed to sell a hot dog, right? You wouldn't want to just buy a hot dog from anyone on the street, maybe. But in a stadium, there has to be an official licensed vendor. And sometimes it's the university or the team, or other times they sell a license to some restaurateur. And so when you spend $10 on a hot dog, that's really an $8 dog, and $2 goes back to the stadium. And if you spent $100 on a goat back in those days, it was really a $90 goat, and $10 would go back to the temple. That makes sense? Just like the stadium, the temple started to skim off the top. And you might start to see what Jesus is getting upset about, skimming off the top. But of course, that's not all. 6, when you go to a football game, you not only buy tickets, but if you maybe are a Bronco season ticket holder, you have to have a license in order to buy the tickets, so you can pay for the parking, so you can buy the hot dogs, to have the beer next to you, and things start to add up, right? They start to add up. And if you didn't go to the Bronco Stadium, but you wanted to go to the World Cup this year, to real football, you would have to exchange your dollars for rubles, right? You have to exchange. It's just what happens when you go to another place. And when you exchange your dollars, someone's skimming off the top there too, right? It's a service. But in Jerusalem, in the temple, in Jesus' days, all the Jews who traveled everywhere brought their local money, and they had to exchange it for the Roman money, the official Roman money, so the vendors could pay their fees, so the temple could pay its taxes. And so they had you over a barrel. The only place you could go was the official money exchange, so you could buy the official animals, so you could go into the official temple and worship your official God. You're starting to see what Jesus is seeing, these barriers. So really, if you wanted 10 Roman dollars, you got to go spend 12 Hebrew dollars to get an $8 pigeon. And it's starting to get dangerously close to economic policy and politics here. But 7, when we have an exploitative exchange rate and an exploitative marketplace, if you're middle class, okay, so you spend an extra $10 on a goat. Not that big of a deal. You can handle that if you're middle class. You don't like it, but that's an upcharge, and you can make it work. But what if you're poor? What if you're a poor Jew like Mary, Joseph? What if you're a poor kid like Jesus, and you grew up watching your parents year after year go to the temple, count out 5 cents, 6 cents, 7 cents, trying to spend every penny they could to buy that dove and to pay the official exchange rates and to pay the official dove and the official priests? And what if you started to realize as you grew up, wait a minute, we don't need all of these barriers to God? And what if you started to realize, wait a minute, these religious leaders, they probably know that, and they still have all this system set up to take advantage of people who are poor? And what if you start to see your family, not only your mom and dad, but Cousin John, Aunt Liz, get taken advantage of? And you notice, as official as it seems, the people with darker skin seem to always have to pay a little more. And what if after committing your whole life toward breaking down the barriers to God and committing your whole life toward taking care of people who are victimized, you wander back into that marketplace. It smells just like childhood. And you remember your mom counting out those pennies. And you see deeply how wrong it has become. And you care deeply because God hated when people got taken advantage of and hurt. So you decided to do something dramatic. Now see, if I was Jesus, I'd preach a sermon, and some of you would forget it. If I was Jesus, I would put a scathing Facebook post on there, and some of you would get really upset. Or I'd write an article for the Temple Ear, or maybe I'd go to a march, or encourage us to write our congressional representatives, or maybe even start a nonprofit. I might, with a barrier like the temple had created, I might just give up on God, or give up on church, as a lot of people have done whenever the church puts barriers between God and them. But I'm not Jesus. So Jesus offers a different example. Instead, what he did is chose a dramatic way to face injustice. He chose an active way to express his prayer of lamentation. So he flipped over some tables. He scattered the animals. And what this is, when the money flew everywhere, imagine playing poker and someone flips over the table and you don't know whose chips are whose. He flips over the tables with all the money. He drives out the animals, which are the supply to get money. So he's put chaos into this system of injustice. And he did that because, and here's where we're going to get to the meat of this. Here's point 8. Jesus, who had been a poor refugee, had experience in his life at being taken advantage of. So he felt the pain of other people who were abused, even people who were abused and didn't know they were abused because they were so used to the system. And he was able to see that because, B, he was in tune with God's heart enough to really pay attention in all places, all times, where injustice starts to grow into a cancer. And he knew that because, C, he had committed his whole life to loving God and loving neighbor, so that he simply could not stand aside when he saw people taking advantage of the vulnerable, especially in the name of God. Now, it's possible that Matthew, who wrote this story, just forgot some of the other stories or just neglected to tell us that, oh, there was that time when Jesus paid $12 for the dove for the poor people. That'd be great. That'd be nice, Jesus. And maybe, Jesus stopped and listened to the victims and prayed with them and held their hands. I like compassionate Jesus. And maybe in Matthew chapter 21, Jesus started his own farm and raised his own doves and sold them for cheaper. Maybe that'd be a righteous response. There's all sorts of soft and righteous responses to injustice. We can all have them. But Jesus chose, in this case, to create chaos and anger. Jesus chose to stand up for people who were hurt by standing up against those in charge of the systems that cause hurt. And he did that by challenging the Roman government, challenging the economic status quo, challenging hypocritical church leaders, and challenging cultural norms that few people had the guts or capacity to realize they were stuck into. So basically, this story is about God coming down to earth, woke, and raging against all the institutions and powers and excuses that people make to be able to rest easy in the damning darkness of injustice. And if that's why Jesus is angry, what does that tell us about our own righteous indignation? 9. This story, this type of story, runs throughout the entire Bible. Some people ask me here, what does the Bible say? How do I read the Bible? This story happens over and over and over of God standing up for people who are being hurt and standing up against the pharaohs. When God tries to give rights to women, people resist him. When God refused to split people apart by race or finances, they said, that's the way it's always done. When God demanded an organized response to support widows and orphans, people said, oh, we can't afford that. We have too many swords to buy. When God refused to allow an us-them mentality, when it comes to immigrants, people were just confused. How could he say immigrants are welcome? When God ignored barriers of ability and age and sickness that so often get in the way of relationship and community, Jesus demanded and showed, here, I'm going to bring everyone to me, and we will show how to break these barriers down. So in other words, the Bible keeps telling the same story over and over, and it's a story that runs through our faith and our life today. In Amos, the story that we read every Wednesday at Rocky Mountain Mission, God says, you know what, you can have your worship. Sing your songs, Daniel. You can make your offerings, everybody. You will make your offerings later, everybody. But God says, that's fine. Do that kind of stuff. Pray with your words. But you know what I really want? God says, you know what I really want? God really wants justice to flow down like a flash flood. God wants the world on earth as it is in heaven. Not on earth with a little bit of racism because, there's good guys over there. Not on earth with enough American liberty for some, but we'll let some other folks just suffer. Not on earth a little better than it was 1,000 years ago or 50 years ago, as though that's a hall pass for whatever we're doing today. No, God wants this world, and this is Jesus' prayer, and this is the feeling that runs through the whole Bible. God wants us to disrupt all injustice without mirroring the violence implicit in it. This means, 10, God wants us to flip over tables of racism and homophobia and misogyny, even if you don't think that stuff's your fault. God wants us to drive out any opportunity for the rich to take advantage of the poor and to call out leaders who give voice to such hatred. God wants us to create a new and just world that cares for the marginalized and the vulnerable and the least of these. And if that means flipping over the tables of the hucksters and the liars and the sheep that follow them, whether that's in the ballot box or Thanksgiving table, we're called to follow that Jesus, just as much as the peaceful shepherd walking with peaceful sheep in a peaceful valley. We are called to follow angry Jesus, who doesn't put up with the stuff that is so rampant in our culture today. And for some of us, our response is, duh, Hansen, that is my faith. That's what I'm doing here. That's why I'm here. And so I preach this so you know that's your faith, not your politics. Ugh. For some of us, when we see the awful things happening in our country, be it urban police shooting black men, which has been happening for a long time, when we see the truly disgusting policies of the southern border, which is happening for a short time, when we see the resurgence of white nationalism that's sprung up solely under the protection of this administration, when we see that stuff, our prayer is resistance. For others, on the other hand, when we hear of these things, we think, I tell people about racism and they say, I don't see it. I tell people about the way women feel, and even women, even on this Wednesday, women said, yeah, I feel pretty equal. I like when men hold the door open for me. I don't think any women really deal with any problems in the world today. Really? You want to know the hardest thing about my job? Is trying to get people to care about things that God cares about when they don't care about them. Because I don't know how to do that. I just don't know how to bridge that gap of empathy. Even if you're more prone in believing ignorant, lying tweets more than the experience of your neighbor, I just don't get it. How so many people, so many professed followers of God, just don't care. Now, I don't like politics. That's not an excuse for not caring. I don't like you criticizing my politician. No, not an excuse for not caring. I don't see injustice. Ain't an excuse anymore. When we talk about the biblical prayer of lamentation, the prayer of anger and sadness, pointed toward a demand that the world be shaped more like God wants it, when someone just doesn't care, it breaks my heart. Sadness first. It makes me wonder what Jesus you've met, certainly not this one, who goes from sadness to anger. So you want to know why I care? I've been saving this story. I warned J. Dean that for 15 years of preaching, I've had this story in my back pocket waiting to share. Finally, I get to tell it. So go back in your mind's eye to 1983, 84, little 6 or 7-year-old Hansen, I don't remember quite a lot, goofy-looking kid with a crew cut, huge glasses, all that. And I was living in the hills of Arkansas, a town quite like Rollinsville. And we had strange families, quite like Ward, maybe. We had this one particular family, keeping in mind the stereotypes of Arkansas and family trees. We had this family where there was a girl, she had some kind of mental retardation. So she was already a victim, but the town decided to have its rumors about how she became mentally retarded. And so all this stuff that came up around town about how that happened. It's this poor disabled girl full of rumors. It's exactly the kind of person that God cares about, right? So on a Saturday back there in 83, 84, we were at some kind of a town festival at the lake. We had a big lake at one end of the town. Big festival of some sort down there, maybe July 4th or something. But something happened, and so we had to drive the back way through all these dirt roads to get back home. And we're driving down this dirt road, and you know how those little trucks back then, the back seat, you could flip the back seat down, and you just had your knees all curled up like this, no matter how big. Yeah, some of you might still have those trucks. I was back there. And we're driving down the road, and we see the girl. The girl who is nowhere near her house, miles away, wandering down a dirt road. She can't communicate, she can't speak. So we pick her up, and she sits like in the stick shift next to my mom, and I was a little nervous about her because I'd heard rumors and whatnot. But what she did is she just smelled my mother's hair. I could watch her lean over and smell my mother's hair, and I thought that was kind of sweet. 7-year-old Hansen knew that, but she couldn't communicate, but she mattered somehow. She barely had any support, but somehow she fit in something in the world. She had a place. So we dropped the girl off, and that story would have disappeared from my memory easily if not for the next day when I went to church. And I went to church. My godparents brought me to a Southern Baptist church, very strict. It's kind of, they have the 10 Commandments where it's, do not do this or else get spanked, do not do this or else get switched. I got spanked and switched all the time. So we're in Sunday school, and I remember, I don't know why they were teaching this, but of course they were teaching about sin, and of course they were teaching about the consequences of sin, and I had no idea how it went in this direction for a little kid's Sunday school class, but they taught that girl was punishment for her parents' sins. Which a lot of people believe these days. And I thought, it's just not right. And because she was fresh in my mind, I said, no, I don't agree with that. I said, there's nothing wrong with her. I challenged the power of the time, and I said, there's nothing different between her, and this is where I could have changed my words that gets me in trouble sometimes. This is like early foot and mouth syndrome. I said, there's nothing different between her and you. And I pointed to the boy across the table who took offense at being compared to a retarded girl. And so he punched me in the nose. And I punched him back. And I got kicked out of Sunday school, which meant I got the switch when I got home. But I stuck with it. Now, I don't know if I had this pre-existing sense of justice and theology at 7 years old, or maybe this story is what led me to think about having an empathy through God's eyes. I don't know, but I learned, and this is still one of the touchstones of my faith today, that comes from table-flipping Jesus. I learned that God calls us to defend those who are attacked, and that it's okay to get punched in the nose by the oppressors. Maybe it's better if you can find a way to disarm their hatred and abuse, but it's okay to fight that fight. Now, I learned early on, and I still believe this so strongly, that I'm sure this next sentence is going to get me in trouble. I don't think it matters a lick if you're hiding behind your political party or your broken economic ideology or your maladjusted sense of religion. If you are on any side that encourages or supports or gives room to racism or anti-Semitism, to immigrant abuse or child endangerment, to environmental destruction or the glorification of guns, the normalization of misogyny and sexual harassment, etc., etc., we don't have to name the elephant in the room, but if you're on any side that encourages that, get ready for Jesus to flip your tables. And if you're trying to be on Jesus' side, you're going to mess up. You're going to flip some wrong tables. You're going to cause chaos in places where there should be calm. But still, as you try to be on God's side, it is high time that we do flip some tables with Him. Justice does not mirror the abuse of the unjust, but we are called by God to set things right in a broken world. And if you don't have the powerful childhood experience that Jesus and I had, okay. Even if you don't have the profound Jesus-shaped sense of spirit that leads you to understand people's hearts, okay. Even if you haven't given your whole life of calling to an faith-informed action, Jesus is still your best example, step by step, little by little, how to treat your neighbors, how to create a better world for your neighbors. So pray with a little more open heart, and when you feel that empathy, you'll be closer to a prayer of fixing those problems and healing those pains. Pray for a closer relationship with God, and you'll be closer to being able to P-R-A-Y for the P-R-E-Y and stand up against the predators. Pray for the guidance of a loving spirit, and you'll be closer to giving the small sacrifices that break down rampant injustices in the world. And if you need some ideas for how to do that, they're in your bulletin. I put like 10 things in there that you can do, and those are just the tiniest bit of a start because you all have ideas. You all have God's Spirit running through your heart for how to make this world a little bit more like heaven on earth. And now let's sing a song about a God who keeps God's eye on even the smallest and the weakest.